The bell rang at exactly 9:30 a.m., a crisp, metallic sound that echoed through the marble-floored trading floor of the NASDAQ market site in Times Square. Garrett Holloway stood center stage, his hand poised over the ceremonial button, a grin stretched across his face wide enough to show both rows of perfectly whitened teeth. The cameras loved him 6'2" tailored Navy Tom Ford suit that probably cost more than most people's monthly rent. Dark hair swept back with just enough product to look effortless. Behind him, the Vault Secure executive team clustered in matching company blazers, each face radiating the kind of forced enthusiasm reserved for corporate photo ops and hostage videos. $800 million. That's what the ticker said when the numbers went live. $800 million in market capitalization for a company that, according to Garrett's carefully crafted origin story, had been born in a garage 18 months ago. The reporter from CNBC leaned in with her microphone, her expression a practiced blend of admiration and professional skepticism. "How did you build this encryption empire from scratch?" Mr. Holloway Garrett's answer came smooth as aged bourbon. Late nights in a garage, vision nobody believed in, black coffee, and refusal to quit. The camera ate it up. He gestured broadly when he spoke about innovation, about disrupting the cybersecurity space, about bringing enterprise-grade protection to companies that couldn't afford the legacy players. Every word landed exactly where he intended, but the camera didn't catch what mattered, didn't pan down to the crowd gathered below the platform where invited guests and curious tourists pressed against the velvet ropes, didn't zoom in on the woman standing 3 rows back, her posture so still she might have been carved from stone. Cassandra Whitmore, though the world knew her as Cassandra Moore, if it knew her at all, watched the spectacle with eyes the color of winter slate. Her chestnut hair pulled back in a low bun that had come loose on one side. A gray cardigan that had seen better seasons hung from shoulders that seemed smaller than they should be, like she'd been folding in on herself for so long her body had forgotten how to take up space. In her hands, she held a manila folder, thick. The kind of thickness that came from 397 pages of evidence meticulously organized, color-tabbed, annotated in her precise block lettering. Her thumb traced the edge of the folder, a nervous habit she'd developed somewhere between filing the complaint and watching her ex-husband ring the opening bell with her stolen code. The applause swelled. Garrett raised both arms like a prize fighter, and the Vault Secure team erupted in cheers that sounded genuine if you didn't know they'd rehearsed this moment in 3 separate dry runs. Sloane Merrick stood closest to Garrett, her blonde hair cascading in waves that definitely came from a $200 blowout. The 5-carat diamond on her left hand caught the studio lights, throwing tiny rainbows across the polished floor. Chief Marketing Officer now. Fiancé. The woman who'd sent late-night texts to Garrett starting 18 months ago when Cassandra had still believed the distance growing between them was about work stress and not about being systematically erased from her own life. Cassandra's grip tightened on the folder. 3 years. She'd given him 3 years of her life, her ideas, her trust. Had sat across from him at their cramped kitchen table in that studio apartment in Hell's Kitchen and walked him through encryption protocols while he nodded along scribbling notes on a yellow legal pad he claimed helped him understand the business applications. How many nights had she explained the mathematics of her multi-layer adaptive system? How many dinners interrupted by her sketching out architectural diagrams on napkins because he'd asked just the right question to make her think he actually cared about understanding? The bitter taste of hindsight filled her mouth like old pennies. Someone jostled her from behind a trader in a company polo trying to get a better angle for his phone camera. Cassandra stepped aside automatically the way she'd spent 3 years stepping aside, making herself smaller, quieter, less, because Garrett had needed room to grow to network to become the man he was meant to be. And what was she? Just a software engineer pulling $65,000 a year debugging code for a mid-tier financial services company while her husband closed million-dollar deals and came home smelling like whiskey and someone else's perfume. Her phone buzzed in her coat pocket. She knew without looking it was her mother. Vivian Whitmore didn't text. She had people for that, but she'd made an exception today. Watching the message probably said, one word, Maximum impact. That was Vivian's style. $40 billion in net worth, most of it tied up in Whitmore Technologies, the cloud infrastructure company that powered 60% of Fortune 500 data centers. The company Cassandra had walked away from 8 years ago at 20 because she'd wanted to know if anyone could love her for something other than her last name. Stupid. God, she'd been so catastrophically stupid. The memory hit sharp enough to make her breath catch. Standing in her mother's corner office on the 73rd floor of the Whitmore Tower in Palo Alto, floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking Silicon Valley, like a kingdom waiting to be claimed. Vivian, in her signature black Armani suit, reading glasses perched on her nose, not looking up from the quarterly reports spread across her desk. You want to throw away your legacy to work retail-level engineering jobs under a fake name? It wasn't a question. Vivian didn't do questions when she'd already calculated the answer. I want to know if someone can love me for me, not for the $40 billion. Vivian had looked up. Then her dark eyes the same shade as Cassandra's, measuring her daughter with the precision of someone who'd built an empire by never making assumptions. 5 years. That's what I'll give you. 5 years to find your authentic love story. After that, you come back and take your place as CTO. This company will be yours someday, Cassandra, whether you want it or not. The deal had seemed reasonable at 20, romantic even. She'd changed her name to Moore. Her grandmother's maiden name scrubbed her digital footprint, taken an apartment in Brooklyn that leaked when it rained. Had met Garrett at a startup networking event 3 years later where he'd been working sales for a cybersecurity firm, and she'd been the awkward engineer in the corner nursing a warm beer. He'd approached her, called her interesting, asked about her work with genuine-seeming curiosity that had felt like sunlight after years of being invisible. She'd thought she'd won, thought she'd found someone who saw past the wealth she'd left behind to the person underneath, thought the way he listened when she talked about code meant he valued her mind. Turns out he'd been valuing it very differently than she'd imagined. The crowd started to disperse as the ceremony concluded. Garrett descended from the platform, immediately swarmed by analysts and journalists. Cassandra watched him work the room, the firm handshakes, the practiced laugh, the way he touched people's elbows to make them feel included in some exclusive circle of his attention. He was good at this part. Always had been. Sales was about reading people, understanding what they wanted to hear, delivering it with enough conviction to make belief feel like their own idea. He'd read her perfectly, had understood exactly what she'd wanted to be seen as brilliant, capable, worthy, and had fed that need with such precision she'd handed him everything. Her code, her innovations, her dignity, all of it gift-wrapped in her desperate desire to matter to someone. A hand touched her shoulder and Cassandra jerked, nearly dropping the folder. She spun to find Julian Thorne standing behind her, his expression carefully neutral, in the way that meant he was working very hard to keep it that way. 45 years old, silver creeping into his temples, wearing a charcoal suit that fit like it had been made for him because it definitely had been. Chief Financial Officer of Vault Secure. Also the only person in this building who knew who she really was. You shouldn't be here. His voice stayed low, meant for her ears only. Cassandra straightened her spine, trying to reclaim some of the height she'd spent 3 years surrendering. I have every right to be here. Public event. Julian's jaw tightened. He glanced toward Garrett, who was still holding court with the press, then back to her. That folder. Tell me that's not what I think it is. 400 pages of evidence that Garrett Holloway stole every line of code in the Vault Secure encryption platform from his ex-wife and filed a fraudulent patent claim. So yes, it's exactly what you think it is. Something shifted in Julian's expression. Relief, maybe, or vindication. He'd been there 3 years ago, CFO at the small cybersecurity firm where both she and Garrett had worked. Had sat in on the meeting where Cassandra had presented her adaptive multi-layer encryption protocol to the executive team complete with working prototype. Had watched Garrett take notes, ask questions, position himself as the liaison between engineering and sales. Had been one of the people who'd quietly suggested Cassandra deserved more credit when Garrett had started shopping the concept to investors 6 months after their divorce. I'll testify. Whatever you need. Cassandra felt something loosen in her chest, a knot she hadn't realized had pulled so tight. "I know. I'm counting on it. Does he know you're Vivian Whitmore's daughter?" The question hung between them like a live wire. Cassandra shook her head. "Nobody knows except you. And my mother. And the very expensive legal team I've had building this case for the last 10 months?" Julian's eyes widened slightly. 10 months? You've been planning this since the patent filing hit the public record. Since I searched the technical specifications and found my own code staring back at me with his name on it. Since I realized the man I'd trusted with everything had stolen the one thing I'd built entirely on my own. The bitterness in her voice surprised her. She'd thought she'd processed this, had spent enough hours with therapists and late nights with her mother's imported scotch to burn through the rage. But standing here watching Garrett celebrate launching an $800 million company on the foundation of her stolen work, the anger felt fresh, raw, like a wound that had never quite scabbed over because she kept having to reopen it every time she looked at the patent database, or saw his face on a tech blog, or received another subpoena request from her legal team. When Julian didn't need to clarify, "When are you filing? When does this all come down? When does Garrett Holloway learn that stealing from Cassandra Moore was bad enough, but stealing from Cassandra Whitmore was career suicide?" 48 hours. The SEC has already flagged the IPO pending investigation. Anonymous complaint. She allowed herself a small, cold smile. They don't know who filed it yet, but they will. Across the room, Garrett's gaze swept the crowd and landed on her. For a second, less than a second, barely a heartbeat, his expression flickered. Confusion, maybe. She'd cut her hair since the divorce, let it grow darker without the highlights he'd preferred. Lost weight she couldn't afford to lose because grief had a way of erasing appetite. But his eyes skated past her like she was furniture, just another face in a crowd of faces that didn't matter enough to remember. The dismissal burned worse than if he'd recognized her and sneered. Julian followed her gaze. "He really doesn't see you." Never did. That was always the problem. The SEC investigation would go public by morning. Her lawsuit would drop by afternoon. And Garrett Holloway, who'd built an empire by standing on her shoulders while pretending he'd grown tall all by himself, would finally understand the difference between vision and theft. But first, she had to get through the next 48 hours without losing her nerve. Cassandra turned away from the spectacle from the cameras in congratulations and celebration of her stolen work. Julian walked with her, not speaking, his presence a reminder that at least one person in this building understood what was about to happen. They stepped out into the February cold Times Square, bright and loud, with the kind of manufactured energy that made her teeth ache. Tourists posed for photos. Vendors sold hot dogs from carts that smelled like onions and ambition. The NASDAQ building glowed behind them, its electronic billboards cycling through stock tickers and advertisements. Her phone buzzed again. This time she checked it. "I'm proud of you, no matter what happens next." Vivian Whitmore didn't do sentimentality, didn't do emotional support or maternal warmth, but she did do respect, and that text, 16 words that had probably taken her mother 20 minutes to compose, meant more than any amount of money ever could. Cassandra typed back, "Thank you, see you in court," because Vivian would be there, not to rescue her daughter or intimidate Garrett with the weight of $40 billion, but because Cassandra had asked her to be there and Vivian Whitmore kept her promises. Julian hailed a cab, old-fashioned yellow against the gray slush of February streets. Before she got in, he touched her arm again, gentler this time. "He's going to fight dirty. You know that. I'm counting on it. Makes the evidence more damning when he lies under oath." The cab pulled away, merging into traffic that moved with the aggressive patience of Manhattan gridlock. Cassandra watched the NASDAQ building shrink in the rear window until it disappeared behind a UPS truck. The folder sat heavy in her lap. Inside, GitHub commit histories dating back 3 years. Email chains where she'd explained the technical architecture to Garrett in excruciating detail. Handwritten notes from her engineering notebooks complete with coffee stains and margin doodles. Technical expert analysis comparing her original code to the Vault Secure platform showing 94% similarity, including her specific commenting style and variable naming conventions. And the smoking gun buried on page 247, a single line of code comment included that read, "Fix this before Garrett's birthday dinner. C.W. the 15th of March 2021. C.W. Cassandra Whitmore." Her real initials embedded in code she'd written at 2 in the morning while Garrett slept in their too-small bed, his phone buzzing with texts from Sloan that he'd thought she hadn't noticed. She'd noticed everything. Had just been too afraid to name it because naming it would mean admitting she'd failed. That her 5-year experiment in authentic love had produced nothing but a man who valued her brain only when he could claim it as his own. The cab dropped her at a brownstone in Brooklyn Heights, one of the quieter neighborhoods where old money went to pretend it wasn't obscenely wealthy. Cassandra paid cash, tipping 30% because guilt was easier than gratitude. The building where she'd lived during her marriage was 16 blocks south, a 5th-floor walk-up with radiators that clanged like prisoners and a landlord who responded to maintenance requests with the urgency of continental drift. She'd moved out the day after signing the divorce papers, taken only what fit in 2 suitcases and a trash bag. Garrett had kept everything else: the furniture they'd bought together, the kitchen equipment, the framed print of the Brooklyn Bridge she'd found at a street fair and loved because it reminded her that beauty could be mass-produced and still matter. He'd kept it all, and she'd let him because fighting over a couch had seemed petty when he was already taking everything that mattered. Except he hadn't taken everything. He'd missed the most important thing, the one possession she'd guarded more carefully than wedding vows or joint bank accounts, her backup drive. Every line of code she'd ever written, time-stamped and encrypted, stored on a portable SSD she'd kept in a safety deposit box precisely because she'd learned young that trust was a luxury and proof was survival. Her mother's lessons internalized before she'd been old enough to understand why they mattered. The brownstone lobby smelled like lemon furniture polish and old money. Cassandra took the stairs. Always the stairs, never the elevator, where she might have to make small talk with neighbors who'd ask what she did and expect an answer that fit on a business card. Her apartment was on the 3rd floor, a 2-bedroom she'd rented under her Moore alias 6 months ago when it became clear the lawsuit was actually happening. Hardwood floors that creaked in a charming way. Kitchen with granite counters and appliances that belonged in a magazine spread. Rent that would make most people weep, paid from a trust fund she'd set up years ago under her fake identity. Money solved problems even when you were pretending not to have it. She dropped the folder on the dining table, real oak, probably $1,000 purchased without thinking, because some habits died harder than others, and collapsed onto the couch. Her reflection stared back from the darkened television screen, hollow-eyed, sharp-featured, looking older than 28 had any right to look. The divorce had aged her, not in the way people meant when they talked about stress and cortisol, but in the way truth aged you. The way learning someone had lied for 3 years carved lines around your mouth that no amount of expensive cream would erase. Her phone rang. Not a text this time, but an actual call. And that meant either emergency or Vivian Whitmore had decided 16 words weren't sufficient. Cassandra answered. "Mom, the lawsuit goes public tomorrow." Vivian didn't waste time on greetings. Cassandra had inherited that efficiency, though she'd tried to soften it during her years as Moore. Tried to be the kind of woman who asked about your day and meant it, who laughed at jokes that weren't funny because making people comfortable mattered. Garrett had liked that version of her. Right up until he'd decided she was too soft, too accommodating, too willing to fade into the background of his ascending star. "I know. SEC investigation first, then my filing. And you're ready for what comes next?" Not a question. Vivian didn't ask questions when she already knew the answer. Cassandra closed her eyes. The darkness behind her eyelids felt safer than the apartment, the city, the world that was about to watch her ex-husband's empire collapse. "I've been ready since I found the patent filing. This is just execution. He'll try to settle, offer you money, probably a significant amount. He already did. Through his lawyer. $500,000 to make this go away quietly." The silence on the other end of the line stretched long enough that Cassandra opened her eyes, checking to make sure the call hadn't dropped. Then Vivian laughed, a short, sharp sound like breaking glass. 500,000 for code that built an $800 million company. The audacity. He thinks I'm desperate, thinks I'm the same woman who signed divorce papers without demanding anything because I was too broken to fight. And are you? The question landed like a fist. Cassandra sat up, spine straightening with muscle memory that went back 28 years. Back to childhood lessons in the Whitmore mansion, where slouching meant weakness and weakness meant someone would try to take what was yours. Number. I'm not that woman anymore. Good. Because tomorrow when this goes public you can't afford to be. You file under Moore, establish the IP theft, let him panic. Then when he's most desperate you reveal who you really are. Let him understand he didn't just steal from a software engineer, he stole from a Whitmore. The strategy was clean, brutal, exactly the kind of two-step destruction her mother had built an empire executing. Cassandra should have felt proud or vindicated or something approximating satisfaction. Instead, she felt tired. Tired enough that her bones ached with it, that the thought of standing up seemed monumentally difficult. What if I just want him to acknowledge he stole from me? What if the money doesn't matter? Another pause. Then softer than Vivian usually allowed herself. The money never mattered, sweetheart. But the acknowledgement, the public record of exactly who built what. That's everything. Don't let him take that from you too. The call ended. Vivian didn't do goodbyes, just like she didn't do questions or sentimentality. Cassandra set the phone down and stared at the folder on her dining table. 400 pages. 10 months of work. 3 years of marriage distilled into evidence and exhibits and expert testimony. Tomorrow it would all become public. Tomorrow Garrett Holloway would learn what it cost to steal from someone who'd spent 8 years pretending to be powerless. Tomorrow the world would start asking questions he couldn't answer, because you couldn't fake expertise when expert witnesses could compare your current explanations to your past ignorance. But tonight she was still just Cassandra Moore, still the woman who'd believed in love enough to give up everything for it. Still the engineer who'd sat across from her husband and explained encryption protocols while he took notes he'd later turn into patent applications with his name on them. She opened her laptop, pulling up the GitHub repository she'd maintained throughout their marriage. Every commit, every version, every late-night debugging session documented with timestamps and comments. The early files showed enthusiasm, comments written with exclamation points, variable names that made her smile 3 years later because they referenced inside jokes or favorite songs or moments she'd thought mattered. The later files showed exhaustion. Comments got terse. Variables lost their whimsy, becoming functional descriptors that did their job without personality. The code itself grew tighter, more elegant, but also more defensive. Like she'd been building walls even in her programming, protecting the parts of herself Garrett hadn't yet claimed. And there in a file dated March 15, 2021, the comment that would end him. Fix this before Garrett's birthday dinner. C.W. She'd written that at 2:17 a.m., according to the timestamp. Had been so deep in the code she'd forgotten to maintain her alias, had let her real initials slip because she'd been thinking about the birthday dinner she was planning for him. Steak, his favorite. That wine he pretended to understand. A present she'd saved for months to afford some expensive watch that probably sat in a drawer now forgotten or pawned or gifted to Sloan. The mistake that would prove everything. Cassandra closed the laptop. Her reflection stared back from the darkened screen, and this time she didn't look away. Didn't flinch from the hollow eyes or sharp features or the evidence of 3 years spent shrinking herself to fit someone else's vision of who she should be. Tomorrow she'd stop shrinking. Tomorrow Cassandra Whitmore would start taking up exactly as much space as she deserved. Tonight she allowed herself one last moment as Cassandra Moore, the woman who'd believed in love, who'd given everything for it, who'd learned the hard way that some people would take your gifts and call them their own. That woman had been naive, trusting, foolish enough to think authenticity mattered more than leverage, but she'd also been smart enough to keep backups, to document everything, to understand that trust was beautiful but proof was power. And tomorrow, the whole world would learn the difference. The SEC notification hit Garrett's inbox at 6:47 a.m., 17 minutes before his alarm was set to go off. The subject line read simply, Revault Secure Inc., IPO registration statement, investigation pending. He'd been dreaming about the NASDAQ ceremony, replaying the applause in his subconscious when his phone's buzz dragged him into consciousness. Sloane lay beside him, blonde hair fanned across the pillow like she'd been arranged by a photographer. The penthouse bedroom overlooked Central Park floor-to-ceiling windows, framing a view that cost $12,000 a month and still felt like a bargain. Garrett read the email 3 times before his brain processed the words. Halt. Investigation. Anonymous complaint regarding intellectual property origins. He sat up so fast the motion made his head swim, scrolling to find the attachments. Legal documents. Technical specifications. A notification that all IPO proceedings were frozen pending review. $800 million suspended in bureaucratic amber. The shower was running. Sloane's morning routine involved 40 minutes of steam and expensive products that smelled like citrus and ambition. Garrett pulled on yesterday's pants, stumbled to his home office. The space was all glass and chrome, designed to impress during video calls with investors. He'd commissioned a custom desk made from reclaimed wood, positioned to show both his face and the sweeping park view behind him. Every detail calculated for maximum impact. His laptop took forever to boot. Precious seconds while his heart hammered against his ribs. The Vault Secure investor portal loaded, and there it was. Trading halted in red letters that might as well have been dripping blood. The stock price frozen at its opening value. The discussion boards already lighting up with speculation. Anyone know why SEC halted Vault Secure insider trading? Accounting fraud. The third comment made his stomach drop. Heard there's an IP dispute. Someone claiming Holloway stole the tech. Impossible. He'd filed the patent himself, paid the attorneys, submitted every form the USPTO required. The encryption protocol was his. He'd pitched it to investors, explained the architecture to journalists, built an entire company on the foundation of that innovation. Sure, Cassandra had done some of the preliminary coding work, but that was what engineers did. They executed on vision, his vision. The idea had been his, the business model his, the execution his. She'd just been the hands that typed what he'd conceived. His phone rang. Marcus Webb, lead attorney. Garrett answered before the first ring finished. Tell me, this is a mistake. Marcus's voice carried the careful neutrality of someone delivering bad news to a client who paid $400 an hour. We need to meet. In person. Now. The law offices of Webb and Associates occupied 3 floors of a building in Midtown, the kind of space where even the receptionist looked like she had an Ivy League degree. Garrett arrived at 8:15, tie crooked because his hands had been shaking too hard to knot it properly. Sloane had offered to come. Actually, she'd insisted, her marketing instincts screaming that this required unified front presentation, but he'd told her to handle the press response, keep the narrative controlled while he dealt with the legal crisis. Marcus met him in a conference room with walls made entirely of frosted glass. Privacy without imprisonment. The attorney was 52, silver-haired, with the kind of face that inspired confidence in corporate boardrooms. This morning he looked tired. The SEC received a complaint 3 days ago. Anonymous at first, but the technical documentation was detailed enough to trigger an investigation. Then yesterday afternoon this. He slid a document across the table. Cassandra Moore versus Vault Secure Incorporated and Garrett Holloway individually. Filed in the Southern District of New York. The page count made Garrett's vision blur. 347 pages. My ex-wife. Garrett's laugh came out strangled. She's suing me for what? Theft of intellectual property, patent fraud, breach of fiduciary duty. Marcus flipped through the complaint with the efficiency of someone who'd already read it twice. She's claiming the entire Vault Secure encryption platform was developed by her during your marriage, that you misappropriated her work and filed fraudulent patent applications listing yourself as sole inventor. That's insane. She helped with some early coding, but the concept was mine. I brought it to market. I built the company. Marcus pulled out another document. This one looked like a technical report, dense with code snippets and analysis. Her evidence is extensive. GitHub, commit histories showing development of the core algorithm starting 3 years ago. email correspondence where you asked technical questions and she provided detailed explanations, engineering notebooks with handwritten designs, and testimony from 5 former colleagues who say they witnessed her present this work in team meetings while you were still in sales. The walls felt closer than they had a minute ago. Garrett loosened his tie, trying to breathe. This is revenge. We had a bad divorce. She's bitter. Maybe. But her technical documentation is airtight. My expert reviewed it this morning. The code comparison shows 94% similarity between her original files and the Vault Secure platform, including commenting style variable naming conventions and... Marcus paused, and that pause felt like falling. And what? There's a comment embedded in the source code, line 1247 of the encryption module. It says, "Fix this before Garrett's birthday dinner. CW March 15, 2021. Garrett's throat closed. He remembered that birthday. She'd made steak badly, burned the outside while leaving the inside too rare, had given him some watch he'd sold 6 months later because the divorce had been expensive and Sloan had expensive taste. March 15, 2021, before he'd filed for divorce, before he'd incorporated Vault Secure, when they'd still been married and she'd still been coding late into the night while he'd been building relationships that would matter. CW. What does that mean? Marcus's expression suggested he already knew the answer and didn't like it. We're trying to determine if it's relevant. Could be a typo. Could be someone else's initials. Could be, it's her. Garrett heard the words come out of his mouth before his brain caught up. She used to leave notes in the code, reminders to herself. I saw her do it 100 times. Then we have a problem. Because if she can prove she wrote that code and it's embedded in a platform you've claimed as your own invention, the patent fraud case becomes significantly stronger. The meeting lasted another hour. Marcus outlined defense strategies, challenged the evidence timeline question. The GitHub authentication argued that marriage made intellectual property jointly owned anyway. But under every strategy ran a current of doubt, the kind of professional hedging that meant even the $400 an hour attorney wasn't sure they could win. Garrett left the building into February sunshine that felt like mockery. His phone had 37 missed calls, investors, board members, journalists who'd covered the NASDAQ ceremony and now wanted comment on the scandal. He ignored them all, walked 3 blocks before his legs gave out, and he collapsed onto a bench in Bryant Park. Vault Secure was supposed to be his vindication, proof that he'd been right to leave Cassandra, right to pursue something bigger than their small life together. She'd been content debugging code for $65,000 a year, coming home smelling like recycled office air and talking about encryption protocols like they were poetry. He'd needed more, deserved more. The divorce had been about growth, about becoming the man he was meant to be, instead of staying tethered to someone whose ambition peaked at senior engineer. Except now she was claiming he'd stolen that growth from her, that every innovation he'd built Vault Secure on had actually been hers, appropriated through late-night conversations he'd thought were bonding and she'd apparently considered theft. His phone buzzed. Sloan. He let it go to voicemail, then immediately regretted it when the text came through. We need to talk. Now. They met at a coffee shop in Chelsea, neutral territory. Sloan arrived looking like she'd stepped out of a corporate photo shoot, cream blazer, hair-perfect makeup that enhanced without announcing itself. She ordered a green tea she wouldn't drink and got straight to business. The board is panicking. 3 investors have already called demanding explanations. Bloomberg is running a story titled, Tech CEO Faces IP Theft Allegations from Ex-Wife. This is a disaster. It's a nuisance lawsuit. My lawyer says, your lawyer says we're fucked. I called him too. Garrett, if she can prove you stole her code, you're not just losing the company. You're losing everything. The patent gets invalidated. The investors sue for fraud. The SEC might file criminal charges. She won't win. It's her word against mine. Sloan's perfectly manicured hand wrapped around her teacup. Is it though? Because I've been CMO for 6 months and I've sat in on technical presentations where you couldn't explain basic architecture questions, where you deflected to the engineering team, where you used buzzwords that sounded impressive but didn't actually mean anything. I'm a businessman, not an engineer. That's why we hire engineers. But you filed the patent as sole inventor, claiming you created this technology. If you didn't actually create it, that's fraud. The coffee shop suddenly felt too small, too bright, too full of people who might recognize him from yesterday's celebratory coverage. Garrett stood needing movement, needing air. Sloan followed him outside. We can settle. Offer her money. Whatever it takes to make this go away before it destroys everything. She already rejected settlement. My lawyer offered $500,000. She didn't even counter. $500,000. Sloan's voice went sharp. For code that built an $800 million company, you offered $500,000. What were you thinking, that she'd be desperate enough to take it? That she was still the same woman who'd signed divorce papers without asking for anything because she'd been too broken to fight? Sloan's expression shifted into something colder, more calculated. The marketing executive analyzing a brand crisis. And is she? That same woman? Garrett didn't answer. Couldn't, because the truth was, he didn't know. Hadn't known anything about Cassandra, except that she'd been convenient, then inconvenient, then gone. He'd erased her from his life with the same efficiency he'd applied to sales quotas and investor pitches. Had assumed she'd fade into whatever mediocre existence awaited people without drive. Instead, she'd filed a lawsuit that threatened to unravel everything he'd built. His phone buzzed again. Julian Thorne this time. The CFO was supposed to be in meetings all day preparing for the investor calls that would inevitably come. Garrett answered. We need to talk about the technical documentation. Julian's voice sounded strained, like he'd been awake for 30 hours. Garrett felt a spike of irritation. Everyone needed to talk, needed crisis management, needed reassurance he couldn't provide because he was drowning in problems that multiplied faster than solutions. What about it? The code she submitted as evidence. I've seen it before. Not in patent filings or GitHub. In team meetings. 3 years ago when we were all at CyberShield and she was in engineering. Garrett's heart stuttered. You're saying I'm saying I was there when she presented this to the executive team, watched her walk through the architecture, answer technical questions, explain the mathematics. You were there too in sales, taking notes. Said you wanted to understand the business applications. The memory surfaced like something drowning fluorescent conference room lights. Cassandra at the whiteboard drawing diagrams that meant nothing to him, executives nodding along while he'd scribbled notes he'd later study, because knowing the language of innovation mattered when pitching to investors. He'd thought he was learning. Turns out he'd been stealing. That was preliminary work. Concepts, not the finished product. Julian's silence lasted 3 seconds too long. Garrett, I'm your CFO. I've reviewed every financial document, every contract, every patent filing. And I'm telling you, if this goes to court, we lose. The evidence is overwhelming. Then we don't let it go to court. We settle. Double the offer. Triple it. She doesn't want money. Julian's voice dropped lower, like he was sharing a secret. Or at least not the kind of money we can offer. What does that mean? It means you should probably Google her real name. Cassandra Whitmore. Not Moore. The call ended. Garrett stood on the sidewalk, people flowing around him like water around a stone, while he typed the name into his phone with numb fingers. The results loaded. Cassandra Whitmore, daughter of Vivian Whitmore, CEO of Whitmore Technologies. Estimated net worth $40 billion. The sidewalk tilted. Garrett grabbed a lamppost for balance, his vision tunneling. $40 billion. His ex-wife, the woman who'd lived in a studio apartment and taken the subway and bought store-brand cereal because name brands were wasteful, was the heir to a $40 billion fortune. He scrolled through articles. Photos of a younger Cassandra at charity galas standing next to her mother. Both women with the same dark eyes, the same sharp intelligence in their expressions. The last photo was dated 8 years ago. After that, nothing. Like she'd disappeared from public record entirely. Because she had changed her name, abandoned her wealth, lived like a normal person for reasons he couldn't begin to comprehend. And he'd married her. Divorced her with a $12,000 check. stolen her code and built an empire on it while she'd— What watched, waited, planned. Sloane appeared at his elbow, reading over his shoulder. Her face had gone pale beneath the makeup. "Oh my God, you divorced a billionaire. Heiress. Not the same thing. Garrett, she could buy Vault Secure with pocket change. She could buy you. Why would she need to sue for stolen IP when she could just destroy you? Because this isn't about money." The realization hit like cold water. This is about being right. About the public record showing who actually built what. Sloane stepped back, creating physical distance that felt symbolic. "I need to think about my position in all this, whether staying at Vault Secure is the right career move. You're leaving. I'm protecting my reputation. Marketing executives are judged by the brands they represent, and this brand is about to become synonymous with fraud." She walked away. Didn't run, didn't rush, just walked with the purposeful stride of someone who'd made a decision and wouldn't be argued out of it. Garrett watched her disappear into the lunch crowd, the 5-carat engagement ring he'd bought with investor money catching the light one last time. 3 days ago he'd rung the opening bell at NASDAQ, had stood on a platform with the woman he loved and the company he'd built, and felt like he'd finally won, finally proven himself worthy of the success he'd always known he deserved. Now he stood on a sidewalk in Chelsea, watching his fiancée leave his company, implode, his entire identity crack along fault lines he'd ignored because acknowledging them would mean admitting he'd built his empire on sand, or worse, on someone else's foundation. The next 36 hours passed in a blur of conference calls and emergency meetings. The board convened, demanded answers Garrett couldn't provide. Investors hired forensic accountants to review every financial statement. Tech blogs dissected the lawsuit, comparing code samples and finding damning similarities. Former colleagues from CyberShield went on record confirming they'd seen Cassandra present the encryption protocol years before Vault Secure existed. And through it all, Garrett kept coming back to one question: why now? If she'd known about the patent filing for 10 months, if she'd had evidence this whole time, why wait until the IPO to strike? The answer came at 2:37 a.m. on the third day, when exhaustion had stripped away everything but brutal clarity. Because watching him climb higher made the fall more devastating. Because letting him taste success before taking it away was crueler than preventing the success entirely. Because this wasn't about stopping him, it was about destroying him so thoroughly there'd be nothing left to rebuild from. His phone buzzed. Email from Marcus Webb. Subject line: deposition scheduled. Prepare for technical questions. The deposition was set for next Tuesday, Federal Courthouse, Southern District. Cassandra's attorneys would ask him to explain the technology he'd claimed to invent, to walk through the architecture, justify design decisions, demonstrate understanding of the underlying mathematics, all on the record under oath with perjury charges waiting if he couldn't answer questions about code he'd never actually written. Garrett opened his laptop, pulled up the Vault Secure technical documentation, stared at lines of code that might as well have been hieroglyphics. He'd hired engineers to build this, had delegated the implementation to people who actually understood encryption algorithms and cryptographic protocols. His role had been strategic, identifying market needs, securing funding, building relationships with enterprise clients. But the patent listed him as inventor, sole creator, and now he'd have to prove that claim to attorneys who'd spent 10 months preparing to dismantle it. He clicked through to the section Cassandra's lawsuit had flagged. Line 1, 247. The comment was still there, buried in thousands of lines of code. Fix this before Garrett's birthday dinner. CW, March 15, 2021. CW, Cassandra Whitmore. His wife leaving breadcrumbs in her own work, maybe hoping he'd find them, acknowledge her contribution. Or maybe more likely just documenting her process, because good engineers documented everything, because proof mattered, because she'd learned from a mother who'd built a $40 billion empire by never trusting anyone to give credit voluntarily. Garrett closed the laptop, poured 3 fingers of scotch he didn't taste, stood at the penthouse windows watching pre-dawn Manhattan, wake-up lights flickering on in buildings full of people who'd wake up to jobs they still had reputations, still intact, futures that weren't collapsing in real time. The view cost $12,000 a month. The furniture, another $50 in carefully curated mid-century modern pieces. The art on the walls, minimalist abstracts from artists whose names he'd memorized to drop at dinner parties, totaled six figures. All of it financed with investor money, board salaries, stock options that were now worthless. All of it built on code written by a woman he'd thrown away like trash. His phone rang. 4:47 a.m. Marcus Webb again. They're holding a press conference. Cassandra's legal team. Today at noon. Federal courthouse steps. Public theater. Garrett heard his own voice from far away. She wants everyone to watch. She wants the world to know whose code built Vault Secure before you have a chance to spin the narrative. My advice? Don't comment. Don't engage. Anything you say will be used against you. And right now, silence is your only defense. The press conference would trend on social media. Tech blogs would analyze every word. Former colleagues would weigh in. Investors would panic further. And by end of business today, Garrett Holloway's name would be synonymous with fraud. Unless he could prove otherwise. Unless he could somehow demonstrate that he'd actually invented this technology, that Cassandra's evidence was fabricated or exaggerated or meaningless. Unless he could become retroactively the genius he'd claimed to be. He spent the morning trying. Pulled up every technical document, every engineering meeting, recording every scrap of evidence that might show his involvement in developing the encryption platform. Found sales pitches where he'd explained the business value. Marketing materials describing use cases. Investor decks outlining market opportunity. Nothing that proved he understood how the technology actually worked. At 11:30 he turned on the television. Every major financial network had sent cameras to the courthouse. The steps were crowded with journalists, cameras, curious onlookers who'd heard about the billionaire heiress suing her ex-husband and wanted to watch the spectacle. Cassandra appeared at 11:58, flanked by attorneys. She wore a navy suit that fit like armor, her hair pulled back in a style that looked simultaneously professional and severe. No makeup that he could see. No jewelry except a watch that probably cost more than his monthly rent, but looked understated enough to pass for modest. She looked nothing like the woman he'd married. That Cassandra had been soft edges and quiet smiles, had deferred to his opinions and laughed at his jokes even when they weren't funny. This woman had spine like steel, stood at the microphone with the confidence of someone who'd been born to power and had temporarily set it aside to see what happened. What happened was me, Garrett thought. I'm what happened. The lead attorney spoke first, outlining the lawsuit in legal terms that made fraud sound like white-collar inevitability. Then Cassandra stepped forward. My name is Cassandra Whitmore. 3 years ago I married Garrett Holloway under the name Cassandra Moore because I wanted to know if someone could love me for who I was, not what my family name represented. For 3 years I lived as a normal software engineer, working a normal job, sharing a normal life with a man I trusted completely. Her voice carried across the courthouse steps with the clarity of someone who'd been trained in public speaking from childhood. No hesitation, no apology. During our marriage, I developed an adaptive multi-layer encryption protocol. I wrote the code. I designed the architecture. I solved the mathematical problems that made enterprise-grade security accessible to smaller companies. I shared this work with my husband because I believed we were partners. Because I thought sharing my innovations meant building our future together. She paused, and the silence felt like physics, something tangible enough to measure. After our divorce, Garrett filed patent applications for that encryption protocol, listing himself as sole inventor. He built a company on technology I created. He raised $800 million in valuation on work he claimed as his own. And when I filed a complaint with the SEC and a lawsuit seeking acknowledgement, he offered me $500,000 to stay silent. The cameras erupted. Journalists shouted questions. Cassandra waited until the noise subsided. I don't want his money. I don't need his apology. I want the public record to show the truth that the code which built Vault Secure was written by me, documented by me, and stolen by a man who confused partnership with permission. She stepped back from the microphone. The attorneys fielded questions, but Garrett barely heard them. His phone was ringing. Investors board members Marcus Webb trying to do damage control, but he couldn't move. Could only watch his ex-wife dismantle him on national television with the precision of someone who'd been planning this moment for 10 months. Someone who'd married him to test love and learned instead the price of trust. The press conference ended. Networks switched to analysis panels of experts discussing patent law and intellectual property theft and what this meant for tech industry marriages. Garrett's phone had 63 missed calls. The Vault Secure investor portal showed the stock price still frozen and a message board full of demands for his resignation. He thought about calling Cassandra, begging, explaining that he'd genuinely believed the ideas were his, that he'd internalized her explanations so thoroughly he'd forgotten where they'd originated, that taking credit had felt natural because he'd been the one to see the commercial potential to build the company to take the risk. But that would be a lie. He'd known. Somewhere beneath the ambition and ego and desperate need to prove himself, he'd known the encryption protocol was hers, had watched her code it, debug it, refine it into something beautiful, had taken notes during her explanations not to learn but to steal, to package her genius into something he could sell, had married her thinking she was nobody and divorced her the moment keeping her around became inconvenient. The intercom buzzed. Building security. Mr. Holloway, there are reporters in the lobby. Should we tell them you're not available for comment? Tell them I'm not here. He grabbed his coat, took the service elevator down to the parking garage. His car, a Tesla he'd bought with the first investor payout, sat in its reserved spot. He drove north without destination, just needing movement, needing to outrun the reality that was collapsing around him. Ended up in Westchester, parked outside a coffee shop that looked nothing like the places he usually frequented. No minimalist design, no artisanal pour-overs. Just regular coffee in regular cups served by regular people who didn't recognize him. He ordered black coffee, sat in a corner booth, and finally let himself think about what came next. The deposition would destroy him. The board would force him out. The investors would sue. Criminal charges weren't impossible. Everything he'd built, everything he'd become would be stripped away until only the truth remained. And the truth was, he'd built nothing, had claimed genius while standing on someone else's shoulders, had mistaken proximity to innovation for innovation itself. His phone buzzed one more time. Text from an unknown number. You could have just asked, could have given me credit, could have built this together. But you needed to be the only genius in the room. Hope it was worth it. No signature. Didn't need one. Garrett stared at the message until the screen went dark, his reflection staring back from the black glass. He looked old, tired, like someone who'd sprinted toward a finish line only to discover he'd been running in the wrong race all along. Outside, February afternoon faded into evening. The coffee shop filled with people coming home from work, from school, from lives that continued despite everything. Garrett sat in his corner booth and watched them, envying their normalcy, their anonymity, their freedom from the prison he'd built for himself. A prison with walls made of stolen code and fraudulent patents, and the lie he'd told so many times he'd almost believed it himself. Almost. The settlement offer arrived on a Thursday afternoon in early March, delivered by Marcus Webb himself to the conference room at Santos & Partners. $80 million. Full ownership rights to the encryption protocol returned to Cassandra. Public acknowledgement that she had significantly contributed to the technology's development, careful legal phrasing that stopped just short of admitting Garrett had committed fraud. Rebecca Santos read through the 23-page agreement with the methodical attention of someone who'd learned to find landmines in fine print. Cassandra sat across from Marcus, watching him try to maintain professional composure while his client's empire burned in real time. Vault Secure's stock remained frozen. Investors were filing lawsuits and 3 board members had already resigned. The company was hemorrhaging value by the hour. This is more than fair. Marcus pushed the document across the polished oak table. It's everything you asked for in your original complaint. Full rights, substantial damages, public acknowledgement. You've won, Miss Whitmore. Cassandra let the silence stretch, studying the man who'd spent the last 3 months trying to destroy her credibility. He looked tired, Good lawyers always look tired during losing cases, the weight of knowing you were defending the indefensible, but being professionally obligated to try anyway. Have I won? Because this settlement says I significantly contributed to technology I actually invented. That's not acknowledgement, that's minimization wrapped in legal courtesy. It's the strongest language Mr. Holloway will agree to. Marcus's voice carried the strain of someone who'd argued this point with his client repeatedly and lost. Anything more explicit opens him to criminal prosecution. Rebecca leaned forward. Which is exactly why we're not settling. You're asking my client to accept $80 million in language that still lets Garrett Holloway claim he was the primary inventor. That's not justice. That's buying silence. Going to trial is expensive, risky. Juries are unpredictable. Marcus pulled out another document, a risk assessment his firm had prepared. Even with overwhelming evidence, there's a 15 to 20% chance of losing. Are you willing to gamble everything on those odds? Cassandra thought about the comment embedded in source code, about 3 years of late-night coding while Garrett slept, about the divorce papers and $12,000 check and the casual cruelty of being told she was dragging him down, about every woman who'd shared her work with someone she trusted and watched that trust get weaponized into theft. I'm not gambling. I'm establishing precedent. This case needs to go on the record so the next woman who gets stolen from has case law to cite, so there's a federal judgment that says you can't appropriate your spouse's intellectual property and call it marriage. Marcus closed his briefcase with the careful precision of someone trying not to slam it. I've been practicing law for 28 years. I've seen brilliant people destroy themselves because they let emotion override strategy. Revenge doesn't heal anything, Miss Whitmore. You're right. Cassandra stood, signaling the meeting was over. Revenge is about hurting someone who hurt you. This is about making sure the historical record gets written correctly. There's a difference. She walked out. Rebecca followed, waiting until they reached the elevator before speaking. You're absolutely certain. Once we reject this, there's no going back. Trial means months of preparation, public testimony, media scrutiny. And if we lose, we won't lose. Cassandra pressed the button for the lobby. The evidence is overwhelming. Garrett can't explain his own supposed invention. 5 witnesses watched me present this technology years before he claimed to invent it. The only way we lose is if the jury decides theft is acceptable when it happens between spouses. And if they do, then at least we'll know. At least the attempt will be on record. At least every law student studying intellectual property theft will read about this case and understand what we were fighting for. The elevator descended 43 floors in silence. When the doors opened, Rebecca touched Cassandra's arm. For what it's worth, I think you're right. Some things matter more than winning. 6 months passed in a blur of preparation. Cassandra officially joined Whitmore Technologies as Chief Technology Officer, moving into an office 3 doors down from her mother's on the 73rd floor. The view looked out over Silicon Valley, a landscape of ambition and innovation, and companies built on ideas that sometimes belonged to people who'd never gotten credit. Her first project was establishing the CipherCore division, taking her encryption protocol and developing it into enterprise-grade security that actually respected its creator. The engineering team she hired were all women, many of them mid-career engineers who'd spent years watching male colleagues take credit for their innovations. They worked with the intensity of people who understood they were building something that mattered beyond quarterly earnings. Vivian threw a dinner party to celebrate Cassandra's return to the company. Small by Whitmore standards, only 40 guests, but every person in attendance was either a tech titan, venture capitalist, or politician who owed the family favors. Cassandra wore a midnight blue dress her mother had picked out, stood in corners avoiding conversation, while Vivian worked the room with the efficiency of someone who'd turned networking into an Olympic sport. Julian Thorne found her near the bar, looking uncomfortable in a tuxedo that probably cost more than his vault-secure salary had paid in a month. He'd resigned the day after Garrett's disastrous deposition, citing ethical concerns. 3 days later, Vivian had hired him as CFO of the CipherCore division. You clean up well. Cassandra handed him a champagne flute he probably wouldn't drink. I testified at the grand jury today. Federal prosecutors building their criminal case against Garrett. What did they ask? Everything. Timeline of development, your role versus his, whether I believed he knowingly filed fraudulent patents. Julian's expression darkened. I told them the truth. That Garrett Holloway is many things: ambitious, charismatic, ruthless, but he's not stupid. He knew exactly what he was stealing and from whom. Do you think they'll prosecute? Depends on the civil trial outcome. If a jury finds in your favor, the criminal case becomes much stronger. If not, Julian shrugged. Hard to prove criminal intent when a jury couldn't even find civil liability. Vivian materialized beside them with the sudden presence of someone who'd been watching from across the room. Mr. Thorne, my daughter keeping you entertained very much. Your Cipher Core division is impressive. She learned from the best. Vivian's smile carried pride filtered through corporate dominance, though I must admit I never imagined she'd return to Whitmore Technologies via federal lawsuit against her ex-husband. Life takes unexpected turns. Indeed. Vivian turned to Cassandra. The senator wants to meet you. Something about encryption standards for government contracts. Network darling, that's what these events are for. Cassandra let herself be led through the crowd past clusters of people who knew her name now, who'd read about the lawsuit and deposition and settlement offer she'd rejected. Some looked at her with admiration, others with wariness, like she was ordnance that might detonate if mishandled. All of them treated her with respect that came from power inherited, earned, or taken didn't matter. The result was identical. This was the world she'd abandoned 8 years ago. These people, this wealth, this suffocating awareness that every conversation was transactional and every smile had a price. She'd hated it at 20, had fled to Brooklyn and anonymity and a studio apartment where nobody cared about her last name. But that version of herself had been naive, had believed love could be found through self-erasure, that making herself smaller would reveal who actually saw her. Had learned instead that some people only perceived what you showed them, and what she'd shown Garrett was someone who wouldn't fight back. Never again. The trial began on a Tuesday in September, unseasonably warm for the Northeast. Federal courthouse, same building as the deposition, different courtroom designed for cases that attracted media attention. Judge Patricia Reeves presided, her expression suggesting she'd already heard sufficient nonsense to last a lifetime and wasn't interested in hearing more. Jury selection took 3 days. Rebecca systematically eliminated anyone who expressed skepticism about intellectual property rights or had been through contentious divorces that might bias them towards sympathizing with Garrett. The final panel, 8 women, 4 men, ranging from a retired software engineer to a corporate accountant to a community college mathematics professor. Cassandra studied their faces during voir dire, trying to read which of them understood that code was poetry and which thought technology was magic best left to experts. Opening statements established the battlefield. Marcus Webb painted Cassandra as a vindictive ex-wife, weaponizing the legal system to punish her successful former husband. His voice carried practiced sympathy as he described Garrett's journey from humble sales position to visionary CEO, suggesting that Cassandra's bitterness over their failed marriage had twisted legitimate collaboration into accusations of theft. Rebecca's opening was surgical. She walked the jury through a timeline of invention and appropriation, showing how Garrett had systematically learned Cassandra's work during their marriage, then filed patents listing himself as sole inventor 6 months after their divorce. She projected emails where Garrett asked basic technical questions and Cassandra provided detailed architectural explanations. Showed GitHub commits proving 3 years of continuous development work, all time-stamped and authenticated under Cassandra's user account. And then she displayed the comment that would haunt Garrett for the rest of his life. Fix this before Garrett's birthday dinner. CW, March 15, 2021. The first week focused on technical foundation. Expert witnesses explained encryption protocols to jurors who mostly looked overwhelmed, their expressions glazing during discussions of cryptographic algorithms and adaptive threat detection matrices. But Rebecca had anticipated this, had hired a visual designer to create animations showing exactly how the technology functioned. Suddenly, abstract mathematics became comprehensible data, flowing through security layers, adapting to threats, protecting information with the precision of something alive. In every animation, Cassandra's original code appeared in blue. Vault Secure's implementation showed in red. The overlap was undeniable, impossible to dismiss as coincidence or independent invention. Even jurors without technical background could see the similarity, could watch visual representation of theft unfolding on screens mounted throughout the courtroom. The retired engineer on the jury, a woman named Patricia Chen, who'd spent 30 years at IBM, took extensive notes. Cassandra watched her underline certain phrases, circle specific technical terms, her expression suggesting she understood exactly what she was witnessing and wasn't pleased. Week 2 brought witnesses. Former colleagues from CyberShield testified about watching Cassandra present the encryption protocol in team meetings 3 years ago. One remembered Garrett sitting in the back row taking notes on a yellow legal pad, asking questions that seemed engaged but were actually reconnaissance. Did Mr. Holloway contribute technical ideas during these presentations? The witness, a senior engineer named Robert Park, shook his head. He asked clarifying questions. Wanted to understand business applications, but the architecture, the mathematics, the actual innovation. That was all Cassandra. She'd stay after meetings to answer his questions, draw additional diagrams. I think she was trying to help him understand so he could pitch it to investors more effectively. And did she receive credit when he made those pitches? Robert's pause carried 3 years of complicity, not that I'm aware of. By the time Vault Secure launched, it was Garrett's vision, Garrett's innovation. Cassandra had become invisible. Julian Thorne took the stand on day 9. He walked through his recollection of those early presentations, his voice steady despite the weight of his testimony potentially contributing to his former colleague's criminal prosecution. Did Mr. Holloway understand the technical details of Mrs. Whitmore's work? No. He was a sales executive, brilliant at reading people, at understanding market needs, at closing deals. But he couldn't code, couldn't explain the mathematics underlying the encryption. When investors asked technical questions, he'd defer to the engineering team or provide high-level conceptual answers that sounded impressive but lacked substance. And yet he filed patents claiming sole inventorship. Julian looked at Garrett for the first time since taking the stand. Yes. He claimed he'd invented technology he couldn't explain based on work he'd learned from the woman he was married to and later divorced. Marcus Webb tried to rehabilitate on cross-examination, suggesting Julian was biased because Cassandra's mother had hired him after he resigned from Vault Secure. But the facts remained. Julian had been there when Cassandra presented her work, had watched Garrett take notes, had seen the appropriation happen in real time. The defense case began week 3. Marcus put forward witnesses who'd worked with Garrett at Vault Secure, who testified about his vision and strategic thinking. But when pressed on technical knowledge, even his supporters had to admit he'd always deferred to engineering teams, had never personally written code or designed architecture. Then came Garrett's testimony. He took the stand wearing a conservative Navy suit that looked purchased specifically for trial. Nothing flashy, designed to make him appear humble and trustworthy. But his hands trembled when he swore the oath and his voice cracked, speaking his own name. Rebecca didn't waste time on preliminaries. Mr. Holloway, did you invent the adaptive multi-layer encryption protocol that forms the foundation of Vault Secure? Yes. In collaboration with my engineering team, I conceived the fundamental architecture and directed its implementation. But the patent lists you as sole inventor. Not your team, not your ex-wife, just you. That means you're claiming you alone conceived and reduced to practice this invention. Is that accurate? Patents require naming the person who had the inventive concept. I had the concept. Others helped implement it. Rebecca pulled up an email, displayed it for the jury. This is from you to Ms. Whitmore, dated February 10, 2021. You write, "Can you explain again how the threat detection algorithm decides which encryption layer to activate? I want to make sure I understand it for the investor pitch." Does that sound like someone who conceived an invention or someone learning about it from the actual inventor? Garrett's jaw tightened. I was confirming my understanding to ensure I could explain it accurately to non-technical investors. Or you were asking the real inventor to teach you about technology you'd later claim as your own. Rebecca clicked through to a presentation slide. This is from your Series A fundraising deck. Slide 12 describes the encryption architecture. Who created this diagram? I did, with input from the team. This diagram is identical to one appearing in Miss Whitmore's engineering notebooks from 6 months earlier, down to the color coding, arrow placement, and margin annotations. Did you copy her work, or is this remarkable coincidence? She consulted on the pitch deck. We were married. We collaborated. So when it suited you, her contributions were collaboration. But when filing patents worth hundreds of millions, suddenly she didn't exist. Rebecca's voice cut like surgical steel. Convenient. The cross-examination continued for 2 days. Rebecca systematically demolished every defense, every excuse, every attempt Garrett made to position himself as anything other than a thief who'd gotten caught. She made him explain technical terms he clearly didn't understand, made him walk through architecture he couldn't describe, made him account for how his ex-wife's personal diary entries ended up embedded in code he claimed to have written. By the end, Garrett looked hollowed out. His famous charisma reduced to stammering evasions that convinced nobody. When Marcus finally called no further questions, Garrett practically fled the stand. But the most devastating testimony came from Cassandra herself. She took the stand on a Thursday afternoon, the courtroom packed with journalists and tech industry observers and people who'd followed the case on social media and wanted to watch the conclusion in person. She wore charcoal gray, deliberately neutral, nothing that screamed wealth or power. Let the testimony speak for itself. Rebecca started gently. Ms. Whitmore, can you explain why you chose to live under the name Cassandra Moore for 8 years? I wanted to know if someone could love me for who I was, not what my family represented. My mother built Whitmore Technologies into a $40 billion empire. That kind of wealth changes how people perceive you. I wanted to discover who I was without it. And did you find what you were looking for? Cassandra looked at Garrett for the first time since entering the courtroom. His eyes dropped immediately. I found someone who loved what I could do for him. That's not the same as being loved for who you are. Tell the jury about developing the encryption protocol. So Cassandra did. Explained the late nights coding while Garrett slept, the breakthroughs that came at 2 in the morning when she'd finally solved mathematical problems that had haunted her for weeks. The way she'd share progress over dinner, walking Garrett through architecture because she'd thought sharing her passion meant sharing her life. Did you know he planned to patent your work? No. I knew he was interested in commercial applications. I thought we were building something together. When the patent filing appeared 6 months after our divorce, I couldn't believe it. I checked the technical specifications 3 times because surely there'd been a mistake. Surely he hadn't actually claimed my work as his sole invention. But he had. Every line, every innovation, every mathematical principle I'd spent 3 years developing, all of it filed under his name with no acknowledgement I'd existed, let alone invented the technology he'd built a company on. How did that feel? Cassandra's voice remained level, but her hands gripped the witness stand hard enough to white-knuckle, like being erased. Like 3 years of my life, my work, my trust had been weaponized against me. Like I'd given someone the keys to my mind and watched them drive away in it while claiming they'd built the car themselves. The courtroom went silent. Even the court reporter stopped typing, caught in gravity that transcended legal technicality and landed somewhere raw. Why not settle? Rebecca's question felt rehearsed because it was. You've been offered $80 million to resolve this quietly. Why refuse? Because this isn't about money. It never was. Cassandra looked at each juror, making eye contact. This is about making sure the woman who actually built something gets credit for building it. About creating legal precedent that says you can't steal your spouse's intellectual property and call it marriage. About ensuring my name appears in the historical record next to the technology I created, not his. She paused, and the words that emerged next felt like they'd been building for 3 years, for 8 years, for her entire life, watching her mother fight to be taken seriously in industries that dismissed women's technical contributions. I gave him everything because I thought partnership meant sharing. He took everything because he thought marriage meant ownership. And if this court doesn't make clear which of us is right, then every woman who shares her work with someone she trusts is just waiting to be stolen from. The silence lasted 5 full seconds. Then Rebecca nodded. "No further questions, Your Honor." Marcus Webb's cross-examination attempted to paint Cassandra's choices as deceptive. "You lied about who you were, created a false identity, hid $40 billion in family wealth. How is that different from what you're accusing my client of doing?" "I hid my wealth to test someone's character." "Your client hid theft behind patent applications. One is self-protection, the other is fraud. You wanted to play normal. You got what you asked for, a normal marriage with normal problems. Now you're angry your husband didn't treat you like royalty." "I'm angry my husband stole 3 years of my work and claimed he invented it." Cassandra's voice sharpened. "If I'd been Cassandra Whitmore from day one, you think he'd have dared file those patents? Or would he have understood that stealing from someone with resources to fight back was career suicide?" Marcus tried several more angles, but nothing stuck. Cassandra had spent months preparing for this, had run through every possible attack with Rebecca until answers came automatically. By the time she stepped down, jury members were nodding. The corporate accountant, a man named David Wu, who'd seemed skeptical during opening statements, was taking notes with the intensity of someone whose mind had been changed. Closing arguments came the following Monday. Marcus gave everything he had, painting Cassandra as manipulative and vindictive, willing to destroy a man's life because she couldn't accept their marriage ending. But his heart wasn't in it. Even he could see the evidence was overwhelming, that no amount of rhetorical skill could overcome the mathematical reality of code comparison and witness testimony. Rebecca's closing was devastating in its simplicity. She pointed to the evidence GitHub commits proving Cassandra had written the code, emails showing Garrett asking basic questions about technology he'd later claimed to have invented, witness after witness confirming they'd watched Cassandra present this work years before VaultSecure existed, and that comment embedded in source code like a signature, "Fix this before Garrett's birthday dinner, CW." This case isn't complicated. One person invented a technology, another person stole it, filed fraudulent patents, and built an empire on that theft. Your job is simple: determine which person was which. The evidence makes that determination very, very easy. The jury deliberated for 13 hours across 2 days. Cassandra spent that time in her Tribeca penthouse, unable to eat, drinking coffee that tasted like anxiety, jumping every time her phone buzzed with updates from Rebecca. Vivian called once, just checking in, which translated to, "I'm worried but won't admit it. I'm managing. You're about to either validate 8 years of playing poor or discover it was pointless." "You're not managing." Cassandra allowed herself a small smile. "Fair point." The call came at 3:17 p.m. on a Wednesday. Verdict reached. Judge Reeves would read it in 45 minutes. The courtroom was packed beyond capacity, people standing in the aisles despite the bailiff's protests. Cassandra sat beside Rebecca, hands folded in her lap with artificial calm. Garrett sat across the aisle, his face the color of old newspaper. Marcus Webb beside him, looking like a man who already knew how this ended. Judge Reeves entered. Everyone stood. She took her seat, put on her reading glasses, and looked at the jury. "Has the jury reached a verdict?" The forewoman, Patricia Chen, the retired IBM engineer, stood. "We have, Your Honor. What say you? In the matter of Cassandra Whitmore versus VaultSecure Incorporated and Garrett Holloway, on the count of patent fraud, we find in favor of the plaintiff. On the count of theft of intellectual property, we find in favor of the plaintiff. On the count of breach of fiduciary duty, we find in favor of the plaintiff." The words continued, but Cassandra barely heard them. The jury found Garrett had fraudulently claimed invention of technology created by Cassandra Whitmore, awarded her full ownership of the encryption protocol, $80 million in compensatory damages, $20 million in punitive damages, and a judicial declaration that she was the sole inventor of the adaptive multi-layer encryption system that had built VaultSecure. Garrett sat motionless, his face empty of everything except the dawning realization that his entire identity had just been legally declared fraudulent. When Judge Reeves asked if he understood the verdict, his yes was barely audible. The gavel fell. Court adjourned. Outside, media swarmed. Cassandra gave them a single sentence. "The truth is finally on the record. Then she climbed into the car Vivian had sent and let Manhattan blur past, while her mind went blank with exhaustion that felt like freedom. Rebecca called an hour later. Vault Secure filed for bankruptcy. Board voted to dissolve the company, and the U.S. Attorney's Office just announced they're pursuing criminal charges against Garrett for patent fraud. Sentencing hearing is scheduled for 6 weeks from now. Will you attend? Do you want to? Cassandra thought about it. About watching Garrett get sentenced to federal prison for stealing her work. About the satisfaction that might come from seeing consequences delivered in person. No, I don't need to watch. I just need to know it happened. Fair enough? Rebecca's voice softened. You did it. You actually did it. We did it. Cassandra corrected automatically. You built this case. I presented evidence. You lived through what made the evidence necessary. There's a difference. The call ended. Cassandra sat in her penthouse looking out over a city that glittered with ambition and innovation and the dreams of people who thought success was about being smarter or working harder, without understanding that sometimes it was just about being ruthless enough to take credit for someone else's brilliance. Her phone buzzed. Text from Julian's Cipher Core division just hit revenue targets 3 months early. You're a genius. She typed back. I know. That's why the patents are in my name this time. Another buzz, this one from a number she didn't recognize. She almost ignored it. Then curiosity won. The text was from Sloan Merrick. Just wanted you to know I testified in the grand jury hearing. Told them everything I knew about Garrett stealing your work. I should have said something sooner. I'm sorry. Cassandra stared at the message for a long moment, then deleted it without responding. Some apologies came too late to matter. Sloan had chosen her side when she'd started sleeping with Cassandra's husband while wearing jewelry purchased with money earned from Cassandra's stolen code. A guilty conscience now didn't change history. The sentencing hearing happened 6 weeks later on a gray November morning. Cassandra didn't attend, but Rebecca sent updates via text throughout the proceedings. Federal prosecutors had recommended 30 months based on the severity of fraud and financial impact. Garrett's attorneys argued for probation, pointing to his cooperation with investigators and lack of prior criminal history. Judge Reeves sentenced him to 18 months in federal prison, followed by 2 years supervised release, plus $2 million in fines paid directly to Cassandra. Though that felt symbolic, she'd never cash those checks. The money didn't matter. The official record of guilt did. Rebecca's final text came at 11:43 a.m. It's over. He's remanded into custody immediately. Didn't even get to go home first. Cassandra read the message 3 times, waiting for feeling to arrive. Satisfaction, vindication, triumph, something. But she felt only the strange emptiness that came from winning a war she'd never wanted to fight. She'd gotten everything she'd asked for: judicial declaration of truth, return of her stolen work, criminal prosecution of the thief. The legal system had functioned exactly as designed, and yet Garrett was still the man she'd loved enough to marry. Still someone she'd trusted with her whole self, who'd taken that trust and filed it under his own name. Victory didn't erase the fact that she'd been that naive, that willing to believe partnership meant what she'd thought it meant. She called Julian. Is it wrong that I don't feel happy? You feel relieved. There's a difference. Julian's voice carried the warmth of someone who understood the distinction. You spent 3 years being stolen from 8 months building a case, 6 months in trial. You're allowed to be tired instead of triumphant. I thought winning would feel different. Winning feels like permission to stop fighting. That's all. The rest, the healing, the moving forward, the figuring out who you are now that this is over, that comes later. How much later? Julian laughed. Ask me in a year. 9 months after the verdict, Cassandra stood in a lecture hall at Stanford University, guest speaking for a computer science course on cryptographic security. The students looked impossibly young, their faces bright with optimism that came from not yet having the world teach them about intellectual theft and fraudulent patents and people who confused access with ownership. She walked through the adaptive multi-layer encryption protocol with the ease of someone who'd lived inside this code for years. Explained the mathematics underlying threat detection, the architectural decisions that made enterprise-grade security accessible to smaller companies, the innovations that had made Vault Secure worth $800 million before its fraudulent foundation collapsed. When she finished, hands shot up with questions. "Is it true you invented this in a studio apartment?" "Yes." Cassandra smiled. "Terrible apartment, too." The radiator sounded like it was torturing small animals. But the code worked perfectly, which was all that mattered. What happened to the company Vault Secure dissolved? Assets liquidated to pay creditors and legal judgments. The technology was returned to me, and I've since integrated it into Whitmore Technologies' Cipher Core division. We're currently providing encryption services to Fortune 500 companies who want security built by the person who actually invented it. And Garrett Holloway. The student who asked looked nervous, like the question might be inappropriate. Cassandra appreciated the caution. He served 14 months in federal prison for patent fraud. Beyond that, I don't keep track. My focus is on building the next generation of encryption technology, not monitoring consequences of the last generation's theft. More questions followed. About the technology, about working at Whitmore Technologies, about what it was like being a billionaire's daughter who'd pretended to be normal for 8 years. Cassandra answered honestly within bounds of what felt appropriate to share with strangers. After class, a young woman approached, maybe 22, wearing a hoodie from a coding boot camp and the expression of someone working up courage to speak. "Ms. Whitmore, I wanted to say thank you for fighting back, for making it public." Cassandra set down her laptop bag. "You're welcome, though. I'm not sure what I did to deserve thanks. I'm at a startup right now." The woman's words came faster, like she'd been rehearsing this. "I developed an algorithm for optimizing database queries. My boss keeps presenting it in investor meetings like it's his idea. I was going to just let it go because making waves seemed worse than staying quiet. But after reading about your case, I documented everything. GitHub commits emails witnesses. If he tries to steal credit, I'll have proof." Something shifted in Cassandra's chest, something that might have been the point of everything. The lawsuit, the trial, the public destruction of a man who'd thought he could appropriate without consequence. Good. Documentation is power. And never let anyone convince you that staying quiet is professional. Silence protects thieves, not victims. The student nodded, blinking back what might have been tears. "I won't. Thank you." She walked away. Cassandra gathered her materials, feeling lighter than she had in months, because this random student protecting her work, because Cassandra's lawsuit had provided roadmap and courage. This was what justice actually looked like. Not verdicts or damages or prison sentences, but ripple effects of one person refusing to be erased, inspiring others to do the same. Her phone buzzed. "Julian, board meeting in 30 minutes. The expansion proposal you requested. They're going to approve it." She typed back, "Of course they are. The numbers don't lie." The lecture hall emptied slowly. Students clustered in small groups discussing encryption protocols and career paths and the mythology of tech founders who claimed solo genius while standing on uncredited shoulders. Cassandra listened to their conversations. These young minds learning foundational computer science and maybe, if she was lucky, also learning that credit belonged to builders, not appropriators. Her phone buzzed again, this time from a number she recognized but hadn't expected: Marcus Webb. "Ms. Whitmore, I know this is unorthodox, but I wanted to apologize. I represented my client zealously, as I'm obligated to do, but the evidence was always overwhelming. You deserved better than a husband who stole from you. And I'm sorry our legal system made you fight so hard to prove what should have been obvious. Respectfully, Marcus." Cassandra read the message twice, surprised by its sincerity. Attorneys didn't typically apologize for doing their jobs. She typed a response, "You did what you were hired to do. I don't fault you for that. But thank you for the acknowledgement." She walked out into California sunshine, the kind of bright warmth that made East Coast transplants understand why people paid obscene rent to live in Palo Alto. Her driver was waiting another concession to wealth she'd stopped pretending to refuse. The car merged into mid-afternoon traffic heading back toward Whitmore Tower, where her division was expanding into government contracts and international markets. The radio was playing something instrumental violins over electronic beats. Cassandra leaned back against leather seats that cost more than her first year's salary as Cassandra Moore and let herself think about everything that had happened since that night in the diner when Garrett had thrown divorce papers across greasy table. She'd been terrified then, heartbroken, certain she'd failed at the one thing that had mattered, finding someone who loved her for herself instead of her last name. Had signed those papers with hands that shook because accepting the end felt like admitting she'd been wrong about everything. Turns out she'd been wrong about different things. Not about love existing or mattering or being worth pursuing, but about love being enough by itself without respect, without recognition, without the basic acknowledgement that her mind and work and innovations belonged to her, not to whoever she shared them with. Garrett had taught her that lesson expensively. 3 years of marriage, 10 months building a legal case, 6 months in trial. But she'd learned it completely, had internalized it so thoroughly that she'd never again make the mistake of believing sharing meant surrendering. Her phone buzzed one final time. "Vivian, dinner tonight." "Just the two of us. I'm buying." Cassandra smiled, typing back, "You always buy. You own the restaurant." Vivian's response came immediately. "Details. 7 p.m. Don't be late." The car pulled into Whitmore Tower's underground garage. Cassandra rode the elevator to the 73rd floor, walked past assistants who greeted her by name, entered her corner office with views of Innovation Valley and Empire Building, and companies rising and falling based on whose ideas got filed under which names. Her desk held 3 monitors displaying code from current projects. The Cipher Core division was developing next-generation encryption for quantum computing threats building on principles she'd established, but pushing into territory that hadn't existed when she'd first conceived the adaptive multilayer system. Her team sent updates constantly, problem-solved breakthroughs, achieved questions requiring her expertise. This was legacy, not the verdict or the damages or even seeing Garrett sentenced to federal prison. But this her name on patents that were actually hers, her code protecting data for companies that knew exactly who'd built their security, her innovations teaching the next generation of engineers that encryption was poetry written in mathematics and syntax, and maybe hopefully teaching them that credit mattered, that documentation was power, that silence protected appropriators while truth given enough time and evidence and refusal to disappear would eventually prevail. Cassandra opened her laptop and got to work. Because that was the other thing she'd learned: justice didn't heal you. Winning didn't erase what had been stolen. The verdict hadn't given back 3 years of marriage or returned the naivety she'd had before learning that trust could be weaponized. But work building something new, creating innovations that were undeniably hers, watching her code protect millions of people's data while her name appeared in every patent application and technical paper and historical record that was healing of a different kind. Not closure, but continuation. Not forgetting, but transcending. Her phone sat silent on the desk. No more updates from Rebecca. No more texts from Julian about legal victories. No more news alerts about Garrett's sentencing or Vault Secure's dissolution. Those chapters had ended. The historical record was written correctly. The precedent was established. Now came the part where she built something that mattered more than revenge ever could, a legacy entirely her own, uncontested and irrevocable, protected by patents bearing only one name. Cassandra Whitmore, inventor, chief technology officer, the woman who'd been stolen from but refused to stay defeated, who'd given someone everything and watched them claim it, then spent a year proving in federal court exactly whose brilliance had built what. The woman who'd learned that sometimes the price of truth was everything you thought you wanted, and paid it anyway because some things mattered more than comfort or peace or the easy path of accepting theft as inevitable. Things like making sure the next woman who shared her work with someone she trusted had case law to cite when that trust got betrayed. Like ensuring no engineer would have to wonder if fighting back was worth it, because someone had already fought and won and established that yes, documentation defeated appropriation, truth outlasted lies, and the woman who actually built the code would eventually get her name on the invention, even if she had to burn down an empire to prove it. especially then.